people hear me okay? Excuse me. Is the audio all right? The levels between the background music and the microphone? Is one of them too loud or? Okay. Cool. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Let me see. Okay. So this is GD205. This is the first introduction we have to actually coding in Unity. So we're going to be coding in C#. So before I even get started, I want to tell you about the reference page. So if you are scripting anything in Unity, you're going to be like constantly using the reference page, so the documentation. So when you Google like anything for Unity, you go to the scripting API, you're gonna like live on this page. So let's say I want to find something like input, and then I can find all the information I need. Unity has excellent documentation. It's really, really good. Almost everything you want to know is in the documentation somewhere in this scripting reference. So we're going to be living there. So anytime you like aren't sure about how to do something in Unity, all you have to do is Google it. It's probably going to come up with a script reference page, and you just go to it, and hopefully it will help you out. So this is, so I'm just going to start a new scene. So I have the project open that we started last week in class. So I'm going to create a new scene. I'm going to go to File, New Scene. And if you have any questions as I'm going along, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will look over every once in a while to make sure that I can address any questions you might have. And so the first thing I did after creating a new scene is I'm going to make sure that I save this scene, because you don't want to forget. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, so I can save my scene. And then inside of my scenes folder, I'm going to call this one week 2. I'm going to save it. And so I can see how it populated down here in the project view. So last week we created some basic shapes, and people ended up making castle designs. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to create over here under the hierarchy. If I hit the plus, 3D object, so I'm going to create a cube within my space, and it creates it in my scene. Now by default it gives it this like random ass position, which is like very confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that that's set to 0 for the X, for the Y, and for the Z, so it's zeroed out in the position. If I lose it in my scene view, I can press F on the keyboard while my mouse is hovering in the scene view, or I can double click on the game object listed over here. So the first thing I did is I'm going to basically create a 3D space in which like a player piece can navigate like different tiles. And so I'm going to change the name of this cube to tile. And so I might give it like a certain kind of material. So if I go to materials in my project view down here, I'm going to create a new material. So I just right clicked on the empty space here. I'm going to create, you could also use this plus over here if you wanted to. And I'm going to create a material, and I'm going to call it tile, and I can drag it onto my game object. And then let's say I'm going to give it a color. Does anyone have any suggestions for like what a tile piece, like a place where someone could stand maybe, or like move within? Any suggestions for what color it might be? So we got suggestions for black, light blue, cream. So maybe we'll do something in between all of those, like a blue gray maybe. That seems like the closest thing to like combining all of those. And then one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the alpha value. So the alpha value determines how transparent an object is. So if I just change it, you can change it between 0 and 255. If I change it to be like in the middle somewhere, by default, I can't see that transparency. So once I save this, I need to go under rendering mode, which by default it's set to opaque. Opaque as in you can't see through it. And we can change this to like fade, for instance, and now we can see through it. So like, since this is going to be a tile, we're going to have to be able to see everything on the board, and it's going to be 3D. You'll see what it means. And so if I want to duplicate this, I'm going to do Control D on the keyboard. And another thing is that like we're going to create a grid, and it's really important for this grid for things to be spaced out evenly, because the player piece is going to move in exact units. So like if you're playing like a board game, let's say you're playing checkers, for instance, or chess, like you know that your piece can only move a specific number, an exact amount. Like you can move 1 unit over or 1 unit forward, or 2 units forward and 1 unit over. And so it's going to be important for our positions to be like to adhere to the grid within Unity of like this space. So to make sure that it adheres to the grid, we have this option for when you have it in the global mode here, you can toggle grid snapping on or off. So it will automatically adhere to the grid. And so if I want to duplicate it, we talked about this last week, which is Control D or Command D on the keyboard. And now when I move it, you see how it's like snapping, it's like jumping to like a full position. And so you can also see over here under transform, if I move it, you see how it's jumping, it goes from 0 to -1 to -2, etc. Going by whole numbers. And if I ask questions, feel free to just reply in the chat. I'm checking it. And so what I did is I duplicated it and I moved it over so there's like some spacing between them. And then I can select, if I want to select 2 different game objects, I can either click and drag like this, so I can select them like that, or I can click one of them, hold down Control, and then click the other one. If you're using a Mac, whenever I say Control, just think of Command, and it'll do the same thing. So I want to duplicate it again. I want to do Control D. And so now I have like the start of this grid. So I want to select all 4 of these. I want to duplicate them again. Control D. And so you can see how this grid is starting to form. So I can select all of these. I can also select them in the hierarchy. You thought I was Shift for what? So I'm going to duplicate this again. So I'm making sure that everything is evenly spaced. So when I look at this, this is -2. Sorry, it's 0 on the X. Now it's 2 on the X. Now it's 4. So it's moving by units of 2. I thought it was Shift choosing objects. So if I want to select one and then I want to select a range, I can hold down Shift and then select one, and it will select all of the ones from the first one I clicked to the last one I clicked. If I want to select a specific one, let's say I want to deselect one of these, I can hold down Control and I can deselect one by holding down Control and then clicking. Does that make sense? So again, I'm just duplicating this. Control D. Okay, cool. And then I have like a whole bunch now. I'm gonna go like 3D. I'm gonna duplicate them, Control D. Now I've moved them up in space. I'm gonna duplicate them again, Control D. So now we have like a kind of a crazy looking grid here. It's a 3-dimensional grid. I could make these objects even bigger if I wanted to. So like if I wanted to scale these up so that there was less empty space between each of these rows, I could select all of them by selecting the first tile, scrolling down to the bottom, holding down the shift key, and then selecting the last one. And then I could change the scale. So right now they're cubes and we want to keep them that way. But let's say I made them a scale of 1.5 for the X, the Y, and the Z. So now they're like a little bit closer together. So you can see how they're fitting a little bit more nicely, a little bit more nicely, They look a little bit closer together. Maybe I'll make them even bigger. Maybe I'll make it like 1.75. So I can see some space within this. So were people able to understand what we did just now, where we created the individual tile, we gave it a material, we created that custom material, and then we started duplicating things, making sure that they were fitting within the grid so that like each of these position values are whole numbers. What was the key to make them move by perfect space? So normally it would be like control. If you hold down control and then you move something along an axis, it will snap. What I did just now is I set this selection mode to global, and then there is this toggle grid snapping on or off. So I toggled it on. So now by default, when I move something, it moves within that grid. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I'm going to, and I'm gonna like, so we have all of these tiles and right now they're all loose. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create, if I go to this plus, I can create an empty game object. So the empty game object doesn't like do anything, it's just for organization in the hierarchy. So I can create this empty game object. Again, it puts it at some weird random position. So I'm gonna set it to 0, 0, 0. And I'm gonna call this my, I'm gonna call it field. So my field of tiles. So if I select all of my tiles and then I drag them on top of the field, it will make them a child of the field. So now if I select the field, if I want to select all of them, all I have to do is move the field like this. So I just moved it back. So just to show you how it's like good for hierarchy, good for organization, stuff like that. So now we're thinking about, we have this field of tiles. We want to have something that like a player can navigate. So first of all, I have my main camera. And so if I select it, I have a camera preview here. So I'm just gonna move it so that I can see a little bit better and I can see this preview. And again, if you want to like snap the rotations as well, you can hold down control. And so and I can see a bigger preview if I go to the game tab here. I can get an idea of where things are in space. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a tile that is in like, let's see, I guess I'll select the one in the bottom right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this tile because I like its position. So I selected that specific tile. I'm going to do Control D on my keyboard. And I'm going to call, this one's not going to be a tile. It's going to represent the player. So it's, when I duplicated it, it's still a child of field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove it from the field. We have a lot of tiles. Are people doing okay? Are there any questions? And so I'm going to go ahead and create another material here. So this time in the product view, I'm going to use the plus. I'm going to go to material and I'm going to call this one player mat. Mat stands for material. And I will drag this one onto my player. And then what's a good color for a player piece? do you think a good color would be? Maybe I'll make the scale a little bit smaller so it fits within the tile. So clips, suggested red, and Gray Eden suggested red/blue. So what I'm going to do for this player mat is I'm actually going to clips. Okay, got it. I can actually set the albedo here, which is the main color. So I can set this to red. So it has a red primary color. And then what I can actually do is there's a function here called emission. So what emission will do in a material is it will basically fill the shadows with this color. So if I turn this on, I can actually set an emission color of like blue. And what this will do is, and you can see this in the preview over here, you see how it's like red, but it has like this blue glow to it. So it looks kind of special. So it's both red with like a little bit of blue glow. So I've incorporated both clips and Gray Eden's suggestions. Cool. So now what we're trying to do is we're trying to, we have this player piece, and maybe I'll make it smaller, 1.5. Should it be smaller or should it be bigger? What do you think? Should it be like 2? So it like goes outside of that space. So people think smaller, okay. I'll do like 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. Okay. So we want it to basically be able to navigate this space, and so what I'm going to do is going into my project view under my assets, I'm going to create a new folder. So if I right click on the empty space here, I go to create folder, and I'm going to call this folder scripts. And then when I go into the scripts folder, I'm going to create a new C# script. So if I right click on here, I go to create C# script. I'm going to call this one, I'll call this one grid movement. So this is a script that's going to have the functionality. So our code for movement is going to be inside of the script. So if you've worked in something like processing before, you may have worked with tabs. The tabs, often you give different functionality to it. And so in Unity, when we're creating a script, and the file ends up being .cs, which stands for C#. So we want to have like specific scripts that do certain things, so they have certain functionality. So I'm going to go ahead and open this. So now that's created, I can see a preview of the content of it over here in the inspector. And so when you do that, it will actually open up whatever your default code editor is. So on my computer, the default editor is Sublime Text. So if you just installed Unity, then the default one is Visual Studio. It used to be MonoDevelop. I like using Sublime Text because it's a lot faster. So you just got Sublime Text, right? That's what we were talking about before. And if someone wants to find out like how they can set this up so they can use something like Sublime Text, let me know and I can tell you. Okay, so like if you've never seen a script in Unity before, you're probably like, what is all this stuff going on here? So we have these directives at the top. So we have using system.collections, system.collections generic, and Unity engine. So these are like all of the basic functionality within the scripting engine for Unity. So anything that we want to do that involves Unity scripting is going to be part of Unity engine, or most of the things anyways, at least for now. So this allows us to basically, because if we didn't have these things, it would just be regular C#. We would have to code everything from scratch, the whole engine. But luckily, Unity gives us a lot of functionality that we can just use right off the bat. So the first thing I'm going to do is, oops. If you look at this, it has public class grid movement. So grid movement is the name of our script, right? So this is the name of our class as well. And so everything associated with this class is encapsulated in these two curly brackets. And so if you've used something like processing, does this stuff seem familiar? You have void start and void update. It says that start is called before the first frame update, and then it says update is called once per frame. So what does that sound like from processing, for those of you that have used processing before? So there's something that's like the same kind of functionality in processing. There's something that runs in the very beginning when you start it, when you start running your sketch, and there's something that runs once every frame. So if you've used processing, you know what this sounds like. So we have void start and void update. So because there's something that's like the equivalent in processing. So like in processing, when you start off like a new sketch, you usually write two functions, right? So you create one, which is called setup. So that's the first one. And then the second one, the equivalent of update. Does anyone remember what that one's called now that I've told you setup was the first one? Draw, you got it. So same idea here. So start is the equivalent of setup and update is the equivalent of draw. Same exact thing. So if you just imagine that, like I'm just gonna make some space, just imagine that like for the most part, like everything you're writing in your script is going to be within those two curly brackets. So just imagine that this is like processing with your sketch. And so if you want to declare some global variables or some objects, we can do so at the top here. So that's like after the opening curly bracket. So we make sure that it's within our class. And so if we want to, does anyone remember what the thing is that corresponds to things like position, rotation, and scale in Unity? So like if I was to click on a game object, for instance, let's say I clicked on my player, what aspect of this game object has the properties of the position, the rotation, and scale? So transform, that's right. So we have all of these different like subheadings under our inspector. So we have, these are called components, right? So we have like things called like box collider, for instance, mesh render, and transform is the one that corresponds to the position, the rotation, scale. So those are all properties of transform. And so if we want to manipulate that, because we want something to move, we want to manipulate it in an abstract sense, sort of like a board game. When you move a piece, it sort of like teleports to the new piece, the new position. And so we want to control that inside of our script. So if we were to go to, on the scripting API, let's see, and if I was to search for, let's see, transform here, you would see that it has a lot of information about transform. It has things like properties. So these are things that it stores within it. It has public methods. These are things that it can do. And so if we want to use this, you might be looking on here. And if you wanted to change the position, you could find out more about how it uses position. If I click position here, and then usually it'll have an example. And then if you're just starting off, you might have like maybe too much information. But hopefully the more you do it, the more it starts to make sense. So if I'm going to go back to my script here, and we want to manipulate the position of something, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create you can create a transform. So transform is the class name. And so I'm going to create a new transform. So like if you were in processing and you're creating a new variable, for instance, you might do something like int, right? You would declare something based on the type. So the type would be integer. And then in this case, we're going to declare a new transform that we want to manipulate. So it's the same kind of formula, the same syntax, where we have the type, and you can see that it's capitalized. So you can see how the different colors indicate different types of things within my editor. And so if I want to declare this new transform, I'm going to call it player transform. So I say the type and I say the name that I want to give it. And what I can also do is I can also, like, if you're working in processing, you would have to manipulate everything inside of the script first, or sorry, inside of your sketch first. One thing that's really cool about Unity is what I can do is I can add a prefix to this where I can say public. So before I declare my new transform, if I write public, that will make it something that I can actually assign the value of it in the inspector in Unity. So if I save this, if I do Control S or Command S on a Mac, it will save my script. I will go back. It might take a second because it's going to make sure there are no errors in my script. So if I had an error, it would give me a message in the console. And so there are no errors, so I'm good to go. And so if I drag my script, so one thing is that any script, or generally any script that you make in Unity, you're going to want to attach it to a game object in your scene. So usually, like, you try to associate it with something that you're going to be manipulating. So I can either, I could attach it to anything. It just depends how you're going to be writing your script. So if I attach this to my player and then I select the player, now I can see that my grid movement, which is the script I just made, shows up as a component in the inspector. And you can also see that it has player transform here. So player transform was the name of the transform, right? So it becomes something inside of my inspector that I could assign in here. So if I assign this, if I click the circle with the dot, it will bring up a list of all of the game objects. You can look in your assets or your scene. And so if I select player, I will assign it to this game object. So I could, this transform, the transform of the game object called player. So now I can manipulate this, and when I manipulate the thing called player transform, it will actually manipulate my player's transform. Does that make sense? That was a lot of words. So what I'm going to do here is, everyone good? So if I went to reference the transform that I created that I called player transform, inside of my update, I can say player transform. And then in Unity, you're going to be using a lot of dot notation. So the dots will allow you to access a property of something or a subset of something. So if I was to go back to my scripting API, you can see that if you look on whatever this example line is, you can see that position is actually a property of transform. So if we look on here, we can see a lot of information here. So we can see that position, you can access the position of a specific transform, and every game object has a transform. You can access it by using dot and then referencing the name, which is position. And it also tells us that the type of thing that position is. In this case, we can see that the type is a vector 3. So if you've never heard of a vector 3 is what Unity uses to store a set of coordinates. So if we look at our transform over here, we can see that the position involves an X, a Y, and a Z, those 3 axes. And we know that each one of these is represented within a vector 3. So a vector 3 is basically a package that has an X, a Y, and a Z. So if you are working in processing, you may have been storing like an X and a Y variable separately using 2 different variables. You may have also been using p vector. If you've used processing, have you used p vector before? Has anyone heard of that? P vector is something that just stores an x and a y in one thing together. If you took my class before, you probably didn't use it. But basically, vector 3, it's just a position. It has an x, a y, and a z. So what happens when if we look back at this example, we can see, okay, this example is way too complicated, but we can see that it's using equals, which is to assign a value, and it's assigning it to transform.position, which is referencing the same position as this one, and it's adding a new vector 3. So that is actually a way of specifying a temporary position. So if I go back here, so I can say player transform dot position equals player transform dot position plus an amount. So if I just said player transform dot position equals player transform dot position, and I save this, what's going to happen when I actually run my game? What do you think is going to occur? Will anything happen? Let me know in the chat. So y'all don't think anything's going to happen. Let's see what happens. So when I run this, you're right, nothing happened, right? Or it seemed not to happen. So what that does is, and in fact, if I try to select my player, if I go back to my scene view, actually should have stopped moving. So it didn't seem to do anything on its own though, right? So if we want to actually have it move, so we can take this original position and we can add a new position. So we said that positions are of the type vector 3. So because it's an x, a y, and a z position encapsulated. So if we want to modify that, we have to modify it using the same type. So if I wanted to have another vector 3, so one thing I could do is I could have if I created a public vector 3 here, and I could call it forward. So I can create a new vector 3. If I make it public, that means I can modify it in the inspector, so I can assign a value. And I call this one FWD, which stands for forward. So if I take on line 20, the player transform.position equals player transform.position plus FWD, that will, every frame that this runs, it will take that position and it will add whatever this is. So I haven't specified what the values of these are. So if you are working with in processing and you created a new variable, but you did not assign a value, what value would that be to be as a default? Would it have a default value if it's not specified? If it was something like an integer or a float? What do you think? The question again is, if you were to create something in processing, like a float or something, let's say and I could do it here, I could say float my float, right? So if I just did this in processing, what would the value of this be by default? So Kaiser said, no, you give it 1, but what if I don't? So Gray Eden said it would essentially be 0. So what happens is you would think usually it's effectively 0, but sometimes you get what's called garbage in there, where it gives you a random value that's just based on whatever's left in the memory. So that's why we usually want to specify what that is beforehand. So this was just an example. And so it'll probably be 0.0, but sometimes you'll get a really weird behavior. So you want to make sure that anytime you're game is starting that you have some kind of value in there, at least to begin with. And I think this might be something that Unity does by default, because it knows that people will do that. So if I save this, Control S, and then I go back to Unity, it's going to update the script, so it's going to compile it, make sure I don't have any errors. If I have errors, it's going to tell me in the console. And so if I look at my grid movement, I can see that it has a new thing listed here called FWD, and it has a box for X, a box for Y, and a box for Z, because that vector 3 encapsulates all three of those things. So if we wanted to move forward, which axis would we associate with forwards or backwards? Which one do you think? Would it be the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis? Which one do you associate with forwards and backwards? So Kaiser and Garrick Zomar think the x-axis. So if you're looking at it, it depends which way you're looking at it, right? So if it's, and if I switch back, you can think like if you're, let's say you're the piece, if you're facing this way, then the red axis looks like it's forward, but when we're talking about like global directions, we're thinking about like a north, south, east, west, which is like, if no matter which way you're facing, north is always north, right? So when we're talking about this global perspective, we're thinking about usually Z, right? So Clips said Z. So usually when we say X, we're usually talking about the horizontal axis. When we say Y, we're usually talking about the vertical axis, like up or down. And when we are talking about Z, we usually mean forward and backward. So if I wanted to set this to be forward would be the direction of the blue arrow here. So I could make that, if I make that a value of 1, or actually let me make it 2, because our tiles are actually separated apart by 2 units. So like if I look at this one, it's -14. I look at this one, it's -12, -10, and so on. So does anyone know what's going to happen when I hit play? Now that I've set that vector 3, what do you think is going to happen? Let's set this to 2. Any guesses? I should be able to move now. So let's see what happens. What happened? I don't see it anymore. It's gone. So Clip said it moves backwards. So, and I'm gonna run it really quick, and I'm gonna pause it. And if I like look around, I can see that it's all the way over there. Oh, you know what? I did it on, I said Z and then I put it in the X anyways. So it moved over on the X. So it moved to the right because positive value on the X is to the right. So in fact, I wanted to use Z instead of X, but I was talking about X because everyone said X. So now if I run this, so Kildred said every frame it was moving that distance. Exactly. So every frame, so let's say that our game runs at 60 frames per second. That means within 1 second, it's already moved by 120 units because it moved at 2 Unity units per frame, multiply times 60. That's a lot of units, right? So like if I run it and then I like immediately pause it, it's like already like way off the screen. So like maybe if this is like a player piece, would we want it to like, would we want the player to move automatically like off screen? Is that something that we probably want, or do we want it to be responsive to something? Should it be like something we control, or what do you think? So Great Eden thinks usually controlled. So it's a player piece. So if it's the player, we think that it should be responsive to the player, right? So Kaiser, upon key press, it activates once. So if you're going to do that in processing, you might write if key pressed or something like that. And so if we wanted to make sure that this only happens as a result of something else, what kind of tool can we use using code to make sure something only happens if a certain condition is true? Does anyone remember what that might be? So Kaiser said if, so we can write an if statement. So if we want to, and I can make it like this if I want to, where I have, oops, sorry about that. So we have if, and then we have parentheses. So inside of the parentheses will go a condition. That condition can be either true or false. So if that condition is true, it will execute the code within the curly brackets. If we didn't have the curly brackets, it would just execute the next line, or it would actually finish its own line because there's no semicolon. So I always like to put the curly brackets just so it's very clear when something starts and when something ends. So we said that Kaiser said using key presses. So if we wanted to find out how to incorporate key presses, you might Google it. So if you're like Unity key press, and then it will immediately give you, almost always it'll give you exactly what you want. So it shows this scripting API and it shows this input.getKeyDown. And so get key down, and if you look at the example here, we have an if statement and we have if input.getKeyDown, which is a method of the input class. And then it has in parentheses an argument that's being passed into getKeyDown, and it's saying space. So we can probably guess that that means spacebar. So we could try something like that here. And you can see, like if you look at this, it'll tell you exactly how it works. So we have getKeyDown, and we know that this is the kind of thing that is of the type bool, and it takes a string name. So this is something that's going to ultimately be with bool. Bool might sound familiar. Does anyone know what bool stands for? B-O-O-L. So Kildred said Boolean, so it's a Boolean value. A Boolean value is true or false. So Great Eden also got it. So in this example, it's taking a string, and it'll tell you in the description as well. So this is one way of doing it, and if you scroll down in the documentation, it will show you that sometimes there are multiple ways that you can actually run this method. And a method is just a function that's part of a class. So function method, same thing. So we have here a different way of doing it. So you can see it has an if statement, and the condition inside of that if statement is input.getKeyDown, but instead of a string, it takes what's called a key code, which even if you don't know what a key code is, you can always click on key code to find out more about what that is. And so those are the two ways that it gives as an example. So for right now, I'm just going to write if input, so that's the name of the class, dot get key down. And then in parentheses, I can use either a key code as it showed, or a string that represents a key. So for right now, I'm just going to use this. I'm just going to use the example one, and I'm going to use quotation marks, and I'm going to write space. So we have an if statement. So if the condition within the parentheses is true, then it will actually do the stuff within the curly brackets. So in this case, our condition is input.getKeyDown space. So if the space bar is pressed, then execute the code within the curly brackets. So it will move it forward if we press the space bar. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, Control S or Command S, and then I'm going to go back to Unity. It's going to take a second to make sure there are no errors. I'm going to hit plus. And then if I press the space bar down, you can see that it moves forward by 2 units each time I press the space bar. And I can keep pressing it and it goes off screen. And that's something maybe we want to control for later. So now if you just want to like, how many of you are following along on your own right now? If you're doing the same thing I'm doing on your own computer, just let me know in the chat. If you're not, let me know also. I'm just curious how many people are following along and how many people are just listening. Absorbing information. So normally, if this was like a real class, I would be having everyone do some themselves. Okay, so no one is actually doing it at the same time. So, you know, it's like whatever is helpful for you. So like a lot of times if you only have like one monitor, like I'm gifted to have 2 different monitors, so I can have like the chat going over here. I have like OBS and I have like Sublime Text and I have like a million other things open on my left screen, and then I have all of this stuff here. So this is my right screen, so it's really nice and convenient for me. If you don't have 2 screens, which most people don't, then it's a little bit harder, but you can often like, you can have something be like all the way over on the right and something on the left. For instance, if you're in Windows, you hold on the Windows key and then press left or right on your keyboard, and it will move everything to the left or right, and you can also do the corners as well. So if we were going to do this for some other directions, I might go in here and I can see, now it's a little bit hard to see if I do this, so I'm just going to full screen this. If I wanted to have other, so does this make sense? Are there questions? Because I just threw a lot of new material at people, so let me know what your questions are. I want to help and make sure I don't go too far. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at key code. So if you haven't used key code before, we can look in here and find out what that is, and we can see some examples. So instead of like space with the quotation marks, we can see that the equivalent would be keycode.space with a capital K, a capital C, and a capital S. And then if you scroll down, you can also see a list of all of those key codes, so you can see the specific name for each one, so it's very clear. Because sometimes if you're doing like the quotation marks, if you're trying to think of the name of the key or something, you might not know what it is. So if I'm just going to Control F, which is to search. You can use Control F or Command F to search on a page or whatever. And so I see that up arrow. Up arrow is how I'd use up. So like if we are thinking about like games, the way they work, usually like if we're using WASD on a keyboard, W is usually forward, S is usually backwards. So if we think about like what might be appropriate for the forward movement, it's probably not spacebar, because if we want multi-directional movement, we only have one spacebar. So in this case, looking on here, I can see up arrow, and you can see it more specifically if you click on it. It'll tell you what it is, it'll give you an example. So I can see that all I have to do is write key code, which is the key code class. Up arrow is the specific one. So I'm going to change this to keycode.up arrow. And if I save this, I can go back to Unity and make sure I don't have any errors. If I wanted to have an error, I could just have an error. So let's see, I just added this stuff that just makes it nonsense, just so you could see what it looks like when I don't. So now I have, on the very bottom, I have this red text that says, G-code does not contain a definition for up eras df row. So if I click on that, it'll take me to my console where I can see it. It'll tell me the specific script in which the error exists. So I can see that it's in my assets folder, it's in my scripts folder, it's gridmovement.cs. And then I can also see that inside the parentheses here, it gives me first the line of code. So it's line 20. And then it's actually character number 34, which it's hard to count the characters, but it's, you know, it's in the middle somewhere over here. So that's where it finds the error. And so I'm just gonna fix this. I just wanted to show you as an example. So if you're doing this on your own and you have a problem, so now I saved it, I go back to Unity, there's no error anymore, so it clears it out. So now, if I want to add more directions, one thing I can do is I can add, let's say, backward. So if I want to, BWD, is that a normal like abbreviation for backwards? I don't actually know. Well, I'm just going to use it. BWD stands for backwards. So I could write it like I could write public vector3 backward like that. So I could do that and that would work. But I'm lazy, so I'm just going to add a comma. So when I add the comma, it will declare two different vector3s. It'll declare one called forward and one called backward. Does that make sense? So I could also create one called LFT and one called RGT, I guess. So that's forward, backward, left, and right. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create movement for these four different directions. So what I can use this formula I have here. So I've already done it for one direction. So it's going to be very similar when I do it for the other directions. So I can copy it and then I can paste it. So I have four different directions. And let's say that instead of the up arrow, I wanted to do the down arrow. And so like, actually, I don't even know why I used arrows. Normally I use WASD. So I'm just going to switch that. So I know that WASD, like the W key is keycode.w. My keyboard just like automatically switches sometimes. So, because I have a cool gamer keyboard. And then, so for backwards, we associate it with like the S key maybe. And so I will change this. So like it will do the same thing, except instead of forward, it will move it backward. So another thing on here, so if I want it to move left, I might use the A key. And then I'm going to show you a different way of writing this. So instead of writing this the long way, which is how we've been doing it, what I can do is I can write plus equals. So have you all seen this syntax before where you write plus equals and then it just takes whatever this is on the left and adds the value on the right? So it like automates this part of it. Have you seen that before? And so I don't have to write player transform.position plus, I can just write LFT semicolon. And so that's a lot less to write. And like generally as a coder, you want to write as little code as possible that gets the job done. That's ideal. So a lazy coder who gets the job done is a good coder. So then I'm thinking about the right direction, so I can use the D key, so that's keycode.d, and I can do plus equals RGT semicolon. So I can save this. No, I don't want to purchase Sublime Text. And go back to Unity, it will make sure there are no errors. If I hit play, oops, I had the window too small. And then I can So my other directions are not moving. Only my W key is working. Does anyone know why? Why do you think that is? Because we created these other directions. So we had forward, right? We assigned it in the inspector, and then we created backwards, left, and right. We did them the same way. So why did those keys not work? Anyone know why? So it's okay if you don't know. You need else if, I think. So I don't need else if in this case. I mean, I could potentially use it if I wanted to make it maybe more efficient, maybe. But what I need to do is if I go to player and I scroll down to grid movement. So when it created these vector 3s, there was an important step here where I had to give forward a value, right? So I had to give it a value of 2 on the Z, which is forward. So by default, these are 0, 0, 0. And so when I press those keys, it adds 0, 0, 0 on the position, so it doesn't move it at all. So what would be the equivalent of the 2 for forward on the Z? What would be the equivalent for backwards? So Garrick's Omar said -2. That's right. And then what about left? Which axis do we associate with left? So Clip said -2 on, and Garrick's Omar said x-axis. So we can do -2. And then for right, Clip said x positive. So we could say 2 for right. And let's see if it works now. So now we can see that it works in all 4 directions, which is beautiful. Okay, cool. So I'm going to leave that for now. It's 4:43. So now today we've gone through like creating a basic script, right? So we created grid movement. We created a new transform called player transform. In our project view, we found the script, we attached it to the player. So then it populated with our script as a component. We assigned the player transform and we assigned the values for all of these. And then we had it move based on our key presses. And so for your homework, you're going to have to be making an additional, you're going to have to working on this grid. You're going to be trying to think about like positions that you're going to have to take what we've done today and think about how you can prevent the player piece from moving into certain positions or restrain it so it only moves within a certain range. So this will involve things that we haven't talked about. So it's all about like taking what we have and thinking critically about how to achieve some kind of goal. So I'm going to post the instructions for what the homework assignment is in the river as a river topic. And so yeah, that's all the time we have for today. So hopefully you were able to follow along, at least in your head, and you'll be able to pick this up whenever you're ready to do the homework. Okay? So that's all for today. I will see you next week. Have a great week, rest of the week.